It was the dark winter of 1940, and Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Nazis had swept across Europe in a matter of weeks, leaving the British Expeditionary Force scrambling across the beaches of Dunkirk, abandoning thousands of tons of precious war equipment. Among the wreckage left behind were Britain's tanks, slow, underpowered, and outdated machines that could scarcely match the speed or firepower of the German panzers that rolled with terrifying precision across Europe. The shock of that defeat haunted British war planners. Something had gone terribly wrong, not only in tactics, but in design philosophy itself. In Whitehall's shadowed rooms and in the sprawling factories of Birmingham, Leland, and Rolls-Royce, the British began a desperate mission, to build a new kind of tank. One that could move fast, strike hard, and restore Britain's pride on the battlefield. This was to be the Cromwell, the successor to a long line of cruiser tanks that were meant to exploit speed rather than sheer brute strength. The idea of a cruiser tank was uniquely British, an echo of their naval traditions, where speed and maneuver often mattered more than raw armor. Just as the Royal Navy's battlecruisers were designed to outpace heavier ships, the British Army's cruiser tanks were meant to outrun enemy armor and punch through weak points in the line. In theory, it was brilliant. In practice, it would be tested in the most brutal laboratory imaginable, the battlefields of Europe. By 1941, the Cromwell project, initially designated A-24 Cavalier, began to take shape. But almost immediately, it ran into trouble. Britain's tank industry was fragmented. Multiple factories were working under different contracts, with overlapping designs and incompatible parts. There was no unified production system like the Americans had. While Rolls-Royce was developing engines for aircraft like the Spitfire, they were also tasked with adapting that same engineering genius into a tank engine, a project that would lead to one of the most powerful and controversial engines of the war, the Meteor. The Meteor engine, derived from the legendary Merlin that powered Britain's fighter aircraft, promised unmatched horsepower, over 600 horsepower, twice what most earlier British tanks had. On paper, it gave the Cromwell incredible speed, capable of hitting 40 miles per hour on roads, making it one of the fastest tanks in the world. Soldiers who saw it for the first time were astonished. It roared like an aircraft, leapt forward like a racing car, and could sprint across open ground with breathtaking agility. But hidden beneath that speed lay a fatal flaw, one that would haunt the Cromwell throughout its short career. Speed demanded precision. Precision demanded maintenance. And maintenance demanded resources that wartime Britain simply did not have. The Meteor engine was powerful, but it was also demanding. It required careful handling, frequent tuning, and fuel of higher quality than what was often available in the field. The tank's complex suspension, designed to absorb the shock of high-speed movement, was prone to failure under the stress of rough terrain. And when something broke, getting spare parts to the front was often a nightmare. While the British struggled with their complex machine, across the Atlantic, the Americans were doing something entirely different. The United States had entered the war with one clear industrial doctrine: standardization above all. They did not need the fastest tank, nor the most heavily armored. They needed one that could be built by the tens of thousands, shipped across oceans, and repaired by a 20-year-old mechanic in the mud of North Africa or the hedgerows of France. This philosophy gave birth to the M4 Sherman. Where the Cromwell was sleek, temperamental, and engineering-driven, the Sherman was practical, forgiving, and designed for endurance. Its Continental radial engine was less powerful than the Meteor, but it was easy to maintain. Its parts were interchangeable across production models. And perhaps most importantly, its suspension, the famous vertical volute spring system, could take endless punishment without collapsing. The Sherman didn't just move, it kept moving. As early as the North African campaign, British crews began to notice the difference. Their Crusader tanks broke down after days of fighting, while the American-supplied Shermans rolled on, mile after mile, through dust, heat, and sandstorms. Reports began filtering back to London. The American design was crude, but it worked. It started in the morning, it didn't overheat, and it could drive 1,000 miles with fewer breakdowns than any British tank. Meanwhile, the Cromwell was still in prototype. Engineers debated over gun caliber, armor thickness, and transmission design. One version used the Liberty engine, another the Meteor, yet another used modified gearboxes scavenged from earlier models. The delays mounted. By the time the Cromwell finally entered service in 1944, the Sherman had already been battle-tested in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and had proven its reliability beyond question. When the Cromwell arrived in Normandy after D-Day, it did so under a heavy burden of expectation. British tank crews hoped it would finally give them a fighting chance against the German Panthers and Tigers that had dominated the battlefield for years. Its sleek profile, speed, and powerful 75mm gun made it look impressive on paper. Yet the conditions of Normandy were the Cromwell's worst nightmare. The hedgerows of northern France, dense walls of earth and vegetation, were no place for a high-speed tank. The Cromwell's low suspension and long hull struggled on the soft, uneven ground. Its high speed was useless in terrain where visibility was measured in meters, not miles. And its 75mm gun, though adequate against older German tanks, could barely scratch the frontal armor of a Panther. British crews fought bravely. They used their Cromwells for reconnaissance, flanking maneuvers, and hit-and-run attacks. But they quickly learned that head-on engagements against heavier German armor were suicidal. The Cromwell was fast, but not fast enough to dodge an 88mm shell. Worse still, the Cromwell's mechanical reliability became a persistent headache. Its gearbox and suspension were delicate, often failing after long marches. Crews joked that their tank could sprint, but only once. Spare parts were in short supply, and maintenance in the field required special tools and training that many units lacked. When the tank did run, it ran beautifully. When it didn't, it became a 27-ton steel coffin. Across the Channel, the American Shermans told a different story. The U.S. Army's armored divisions were advancing hundreds of miles across France. Their tanks weren't glamorous, and they certainly weren't invincible, but they were everywhere. Each breakdown could be fixed within hours, not days. Parts were interchangeable, mechanics were trained to service any model, and replacements flowed in from ports at an astonishing rate. A U.S. Army report from August 1944 described Shermans that had driven over 2,000 miles since landing in Normandy, with minimal mechanical failures. The same could not be said of the Cromwells, whose engines often overheated and whose gearboxes failed under strain. British commanders privately admitted that while their crews admired the Cromwell's speed, they envied the Sherman's dependability. There was another issue too, doctrine. Britain's insistence on dividing tanks into infantry and cruiser categories left the Cromwell trapped between two worlds. It was too lightly armored to stand with infantry tanks like the Churchill, yet too fragile to survive prolonged high-speed operations in real combat conditions. The Americans, by contrast, had embraced the idea of a single, medium, tank that could do a bit of everything. By late 1944, the writing was on the wall. The Cromwell had failed to become the all-purpose war machine Britain needed. It was fast, but fragile. Powerful, but unreliable. When it worked, it was beautiful, but when it broke, it stayed broken. The Sherman, meanwhile, was proving to be the true workhorse of the Allied armies, not because it was perfect, but because it was good enough, everywhere, all the time. The contrast could not have been starker. The Cromwell was a tank built by a nation fighting for survival, ingenious, over-engineered, and ambitious. The Sherman was a tank built by a nation preparing to win, mass-produced, rugged, and relentless. One was born of desperation, the other of confidence. And when the dust settled over Europe, it was clear which philosophy had triumphed. The Cromwell would go down in history as Britain's fastest tank that never truly fulfilled its promise. The Sherman, by contrast, would roll on, from the beaches of Normandy to the Rhine, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Italy, covering thousands of miles without ever breaking the Allied momentum. And in that simple truth, the ability to keep moving, lay the secret that decided the fate of armies. It is one of the most misunderstood legends of the Second World War, the American M4 Sherman. For decades, popular memory painted it as a death trap, a fragile, thin-armored machine that burst into flames at the first hit. German propaganda and post-war myths made it seem that the Sherman was hopelessly outclassed by the mighty Panthers and Tigers that prowled Europe. But that reputation, though partially rooted in truth, hides a far deeper and more important story, one that explains why the Sherman became not just the most produced tank of the war, but the most successful Allied tank of all time. The Sherman's greatest strength was not its armor. It was not its gun. It was something much less glamorous, yet far more decisive. Reliability. From the moment American engineers began designing the M4 series, they were guided by a clear philosophy born out of industrial common sense and battlefield necessity: a tank is only useful if it can move. Speed, power, and armor mean nothing if your machine breaks down before reaching the fight. During the interwar years, the U.S. Army had learned that complicated machinery was the enemy of reliability. A tank needed to be simple enough that any mechanic, anywhere in the world, could fix it with a wrench and some spare bolts. When the war began, the Americans did not yet have the experience of modern tank combat that the Germans or Soviets had gained. But what they did have was industry, vast, disciplined, standardized industry. The factories of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago had already mastered the art of mass-producing cars, trucks, and tractors by the millions. That experience, that industrial DNA, flowed directly into the veins of the Sherman. In 1941, when the U.S. Army Ordnance Department issued the specification for a new medium tank, the design requirements read less like a list of battlefield dreams and more like a mechanical checklist. The new tank had to be rugged, easily maintainable, capable of operating in deserts, jungles, and snowfields, and reparable with minimal tools. It had to use existing production lines and materials already available in abundance. And most importantly, it had to be built in huge numbers, without bottlenecks. The result was the M4 Sherman, a machine that may have looked boxy and uninspired but embodied the soul of American practicality. Every component, from its Continental radial engine to its bolted suspension arms, was designed with ease of assembly and maintenance in mind. You could remove a road wheel with basic tools. You could swap out a damaged transmission in hours. Crews learned to replace engine blocks in the field with cranes made from scrap metal and tree trunks. Unlike the Cromwell, whose high-performance Meteor engine demanded aircraft-grade care, the Sherman tolerated abuse. It would start on cold mornings. It would idle for hours without overheating. It could run on low-octane fuel when needed, something British tanks often struggled with. American fuel, supplied in vast convoys, ensured that the Sherman's hungry engine was never starved. But reliability went far beyond the engine. It was built into every nut and bolt of the Sherman's design. The tank's vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, might have looked primitive compared to the complex Christie suspension of the Cromwell, but it was virtually unbreakable. Each bogie assembly could be unbolted and replaced individually, a field repair that took only a few men and minimal equipment. By contrast, the Cromwell's Christie suspension required delicate maintenance, and any serious damage could put the tank out of action for days. The Sherman's transmission system was similarly forgiving. While the Cromwell's gearboxes were notorious for seizing or stripping gears during long road marches, the Sherman's simpler system endured astonishing levels of stress. In post-war tests, Shermans driven thousands of miles in training retained their original transmissions with minimal overhaul. Even the Sherman's electrical system reflected thoughtful simplicity. Wiring was clearly laid out and protected from heat and moisture, small things that mattered enormously in combat zones where rain, mud, and dust destroyed lesser machines. Crews frequently remarked that while British or Soviet tanks required specialists to diagnose electrical failures, the Sherman could be fixed by a farmhand. This was no accident. The U.S. Army designed its logistical doctrine around the concept of modularity. Parts had to be interchangeable across all production plants, regardless of the manufacturer. Whether a Sherman was built by Ford, Chrysler, or Fisher Body, its components could fit seamlessly into any other Sherman. This standardization meant that a mechanic in Normandy could strip a part from a wrecked tank built in Detroit and install it into another tank built in Chicago, and it would work. This approach contrasted sharply with Britain's fragmented tank industry. The Cromwell, like most British designs, was produced in smaller batches with frequent design revisions. No two tanks were exactly the same. Components from one factory might not fit another's. Maintenance manuals were inconsistent, spare parts limited, and production lines often interrupted by air raids or supply shortages. Britain's engineering culture valued craftsmanship, America's valued mass production. In wartime, one of those philosophies proved far more efficient. Reliability also shaped morale. Tank crews who trusted their machines fought better. American crews knew that even if they took losses, replacements were on the way. Every Sherman division had mobile repair depots that could patch up vehicles within hours. Wrecked tanks were stripped for usable parts, damaged hulls were welded and reused. In some cases, tanks destroyed one week were back in service the next. The Cromwell crews, by contrast, often had to wait for spare parts shipped from England. In Normandy's chaos, that could take days or weeks. Mechanics scavenged broken tanks for whatever could be salvaged. The Meteor engine, though magnificent on paper, was not produced in the same vast quantities as the Sherman's power plants. Each breakdown was a small tragedy, each lost tank a reminder of Britain's strained industry. Then there was the matter of range and endurance. The Sherman could travel 120 to 150 miles on a single fuel load, modest by today's standards, but revolutionary for the time. In the 1944 breakout from Normandy, American armored columns advanced day and night, refueling on the move, covering over 2,000 miles across France, Belgium, and into Germany. Tanks were driven hard, sometimes 12 hours a day, and yet the Sherman's engines and suspensions held up remarkably well. A British war correspondent attached to the U.S. Third Army wrote in astonishment that the American columns never seemed to stop for mechanical rest, only fuel and ammunition. He noted that while German panzers frequently broke down during retreats, victims of overcomplicated engineering and lack of spare parts, the Shermans simply kept rolling. That relentless mobility became a weapon in itself. General George S. Patton understood this better than anyone. Fixed fortifications, he once said, are a monument to the stupidity of man. What mattered was speed, surprise, and momentum, and the Sherman gave him all three. It might not outgun a Tiger, but it could outmove it, outflank it, and overrun it with numbers and reliability. The German tank designers, obsessed with technical superiority, built masterpieces of engineering like the Panther and Tiger. But these machines were complex, heavy, and maintenance nightmares. A single broken track pin could immobilize a 45-ton Tiger for hours, an overheated engine might sideline it for days. German mechanics often joked that the Tiger was as dangerous to its crew as to the enemy. By contrast, the Sherman was no masterpiece, but it was dependable. It traded luxury for simplicity, perfection for persistence. Cromwell crews faced a similar dilemma. Their tank could outrun a Tiger on a good day, but those days were rare. On muddy fields, its suspension bogged down, on long road marches, its tracks wore thin. The British Army, already stretched thin by logistics, could not supply enough spare parts to keep every unit operational. And while British engineers tinkered endlessly with new variants, the Challenger, the Comet, and eventually the Centurion, they never achieved the kind of uniform reliability that made the Sherman legendary. The Sherman's versatility further extended its lifespan. Its hull was adaptable, a blank canvas for endless modifications. Engineers turned it into a flamethrower tank, a mine-clearing tank, an amphibious, DD, duplex drive, tank that swam ashore on D-Day, and even an anti-aircraft platform. None of this would have been possible if the basic machine had not been mechanically robust and easily modified. Everywhere it went, the Sherman carried with it the power of industrial consistency. In North Africa, it ran clean in blistering sand, in Italy, it climbed steep mountain roads, in Northern Europe, it churned through mud and snow. Even when its armor was pierced, it burned less readily after mid-war modifications that added wet stowage ammunition racks. Its losses, though heavy, were offset by the sheer number that could be fielded, repaired, or replaced. The Cromwell's story was more tragic. Its speed, once its greatest advantage, was wasted on terrain that rarely allowed it to stretch its legs. Its armor was too thin to protect it from German 75mm and 88mm guns. Its gun, derived from the British 6-pounder lineage, struggled against modern enemy tanks. And when the Meteor's high-octane hunger met the fuel shortages of Europe, breakdowns followed. British tankers respected the Cromwell for what it was, a noble attempt to blend mobility with firepower, but they envied the Sherman's durability. In mixed Anglo-American units, British officers sometimes requested additional Shermans simply because they knew they would stay in the fight longer. What the world remembers as the Sherman's mediocrity was, in truth, its genius. It was the right balance of everything that mattered: enough armor to protect against small arms and shrapnel, enough firepower to defeat most enemy targets, enough reliability to go wherever it was needed, and enough simplicity to keep running when everything else failed. The Sherman could do 90% of the job 90% of the time. The Cromwell could do 100% of the job, but only when conditions were perfect. War, as it turned out, favored the 90% solution. By late 1944, the Allied advance across Europe was a study in logistics more than heroics. Armies lived and died by their supply chains. And those chains were built on machines that worked, not machines that dazzled. The Sherman was a logistical dream. The Cromwell was a logistical headache. Even after the war, this legacy endured. Nations around the world continued to use the Sherman for decades, from Israel's battlefields to the jungles of Indochina. The Cromwell, though respected, quickly faded into museums and training schools. What separated the two tanks was not bravery, nor innovation, nor even firepower. It was philosophy. The Sherman was the product of an industrial democracy that valued scale, repairability, and endurance. The Cromwell was the product of an embattled empire trying to reclaim its former glory through engineering excellence. One philosophy won wars, the other produced beautiful machines that couldn't quite keep up. So when history asks why the Sherman could march 2,000 miles without breaking, while the Cromwell struggled to survive the same journey, the answer lies not just in gears and engines, but in vision. The Sherman was built to endure. The Cromwell was built to perform. And in the crucible of total war, endurance was the difference between victory and failure.